Well, guys, 2020 is the Swamp's last stand, and today's Triggered video podcast guest, Richard Grenell, is the epitome of taking on the Swamp. I got to know Rick back in 2016, really through following his Twitter game, which was, let's just say, almost makes mine look a little bit mild. It was awesome to say the least. So, Rick, the only thing that's good about you being out of government, because you really took on the Swamp, you took on the establishment, you took on the nonsense as our ambassador to Germany, and then, honestly, you're the guy that opened the door to expose all of the nonsense going on with General Flynn and the FBI and the cover-up within our highest levels of government as our DNI. So, I want to welcome Rick Grenell to the show. Just an awesome American, awesome guy. And Rick, now that you're in the private sector again, I look forward to seeing the fire come out of your Twitter feed again.
Well, it sounds like, to me, the perfect opportunity for you to say what my Twitter handle is, if that's really going to be the pitch.
Go for it. Go for it.
At Richard Grenell. I mean, we should put it up on the screen in really big ways to at Richard Grenell.
We really should. And I don't say this lightly. As someone who's, let's just say, not known for being subtle on social media. When my father calls me and says, hey, you're getting a little aggressive.
And I think that you're getting a little hot on Twitter sometimes.
you know it's pretty hot, okay? So if I'm saying that about Rick, it's awesome. So give him a follow at Richard Grenell. I promise you won't regret it. The last few years it's been a little slower because you can only be so aggressive as the ambassador to Germany. But let's start there. Obviously, the DNI stuff is fascinating, but as ambassador to Germany, you got to see sort of, the underbelly of the deep state. You got to see some of the subversion. I mean, you were a big part of sort of Donald Trump holding NATO accountable, as well as, combating sort of, Europe's dealings with Iran and boosting, what we all know is a common enemy, but sort of putting aside the fact that these guys are the world's largest state sponsor of terror because, maybe we can sell them a couple cars. Why don't you talk about your experience there, what you saw, and how Donald Trump and this administration have been able to change things?
It's a perfect question and segue, and I appreciate it because, I spent 8 years at the UN. And if you've ever spent 1 second at the UN and you walk into the General Assembly Hall and you see, the 193 placards of countries across the world, as an American, your first instinct is to say, where are the Europeans? Where are our friends? Where are people who believe in the rule of law and human rights and capitalism? And we don't have to make excuses about that. I saw 8 years at the UN inside the Security Council that when the Americans try to negotiate with what we call the E3, the French, the British, and the Germans, that the weakest link in that transatlantic pro-West conversation, it was the Germans. They literally wanted to have an economic focus that was Germany first and a foreign policy that was like Switzerland. They wanted to be everybody's friend. And so what I realized is that there isn't the same threat assessment that we as Americans have about Iran or China or Russia. That's not the same threat assessment that the Germans have. And that's sad to me because Americans have given so much for Germany and multiple times we've been there. So I wanted to go to Germany because I wanted to be a very pro-American voice to say we love Germany and we cannot allow Germany to drift into this space where it's jello and where it's not firmly pro-West. And you see that with Nord Stream 2, where they take too much Russian gas. At the same time, they were unwilling to pay their 2% NATO share. And by the way, here's one thing. Out of all of the NATO countries, there's only one that hasn't given this plan to NATO, which is called a credible plan of how do we get to 2%, a credible plan of spending the money that you said that you will spend. And so I think there's just a sense in Germany that why do we have to really buy military equipment when Russia's our friend and Iran is our friend? That type of mentality is what I wanted to really push against, mainly because we love Germany and we want the Germans to be like the German business community, which is solidly with the West.
100%. I mean, that was always to me, to those who may not fully understand what we're talking about. I mean, the Germans definitely, making sure that America puts in their share of what everyone's agreed to. We're not asking them to do anything more. We're just asking them to agree to what everyone signed on to.
If NATO countries made their full and complete contributions, then NATO would be even stronger than it is today.
So they're going crazy that America threatens to cut back since they are not putting in their full share because they want protections from the Russians, who they are signing billion-dollar oil deals with to take Russian oil. They could take American oil and gas. They could do all of those things, but they don't. So they want to enrich the Russians, who they are then begging us to protect them from. It's absolutely mind-boggling. And I'm glad to see that there's a distinction, Rick, between sort of the German business community and the German government.
There is absolutely this big distinction because the German business community is absolutely invested in America. I mean, you look at the great German airline Lufthansa, they've got 15,000 American employees. Siemens, the great, huge German company, has 45,000 American employees. These German companies know that capitalism and pro-West policies are their future. Let me just add one thing about the troops that is very important. There are a whole bunch of even Republicans that are beginning to say, oh, we got to leave all these troops in Germany. President Trump has decided that 25,000 troops should be the limit. I think 25,000 troops in Germany is a lot. I think that that's enough. But
especially when their ambassador said, didn't he just say like last week, well, it's mostly symbolic. Well, I'm glad we're spending billions of dollars keeping troops there to protect you because you think it's symbolic and not real. I mean, that's why we got to wake up.
Yeah, we got too many Republicans who want to keep sending men and women overseas and paying for them. Again, they're arguing, Washington, D.C. politicians are arguing from both sides of the aisle that 25,000 troops in Germany is too little. It's not enough. And I think that's crazy. I think we've got to start spending money in a smart way on America. 25,000 troops in Germany is a lot of troops. I think that's enough.
So talk a little bit about that. I mean, you obviously, we've had so much of the pushback from Europe because America is taking a stance that's actually America first. It's shocking that any country would actually have a policy that wouldn't put their country first. But it's not just those countries. You actually see a lot of pushback, and if you weren't a believer in the deep state prior to 2016, maybe I would understand that. But you have these sort of deep state, DC swamp creature, former intelligence people, all this nonsense, pushing back on Trump's agenda, which is putting America first. Talk a little bit about it because, obviously they went after you, almost as hard as they went after President Trump because you were literally exposing the subversion that they were putting forth.
Yeah, first of all, I'm a gay Republican. I've been under assault for a very long time. If you're
it's pretty freeing once you're used to being canceled for your whole life, Rick. I mean, I know we've had this conversation before. I sort of say it. I'm like, they're like, wow, Don, I can't believe you're saying that. I was like, I've been canceled 1,500 times this week alone. It doesn't have any effect on me. So I hope others start feeling the same way. Stop caring, and it doesn't matter. I promise you it's very freeing.
Yeah, it is very freeing, and you see it across the board with people like Dave Rubin and others who really just say, I'm not really caring too much what they say. I think as gay conservatives, we've really honed our skills to always be in a fight, always be in a dialogue to say, what do you believe? You don't ever get a pass from your own party or from cocktail parties. And so it's important that you know who you are and what you believe. And so that's been kind of my whole life of being that libertarian, let me decide my life, government should be small type of viewpoints. But I think that what we have in Washington right now is no longer a fight between Republicans and Democrats. It's a fight between Washington and the rest of America. What's happening when you see Washington, D.C. now wanting to be a state? There is a culture there of politicians, of media people, of lobbyists. It's no wonder that everybody in Washington, D.C. who has a paycheck, who's been sitting at home, having that paycheck is suddenly the ones that are telling everybody else who are, dependent upon working to get a paycheck that you should just stay home, and that they're just so comfortable with this idea because they are getting a paycheck. And so this is the Washington, D.C. culture of people who are cheering for Washington, D.C. to grow. They want bigger budgets. They're reporting on Washington, D.C. because their kids go to school there and they protect it. They fiercely protect it. That's not the spirit of what our founding fathers had. They thought that people would go to Washington, D.C., make the best laws that they think is possible, and then leave the place and go back and live under those laws. And that's not what we have right now. Why do you think that when we have an economic slump, Washington, D.C. continues to grow?
Well, by the way, I think the statistic is something like, it's close to like 9 out of 10 of the top richest counties in America surround Washington, D.C. Now ask, what do they create? What do they build? Nothing. They don't. They literally do nothing other than they peddle in influence, and they've locked themselves in there. They've gotten themselves rich. They've gotten their friends rich. If you're the Bidens, they've gotten the entire family rich. Why would they ever change that system? So Donald Trump coming in as the outsider was such a threat to that, which is why, frankly, you see the attacks from both sides. I mean, prior to COVID, there literally wasn't a single economic metric where we weren't better off as a country. But they still wanted to fight that because, you know what, if you're chipping into their little nest egg and what they've, entrenched and created for themselves for so long, even if it benefits, the other 350 million Americans outside of there, that's too much. We can't support those people. We got to take care of our interests only.
Yeah. And, there's a thread of this, and I'm sure that the media are going to go crazy when I say this, but there's a thread of this that is what the Bernie Sanders voters have been onto, which is that Washington, D.C. is really corrupt. And while I don't accept their premise on how to solve some of this, they've recognized the problem of Washington, D.C. I'll even say that the politicians who go to Washington, D.C. and stay there for decades and never leave and then get jobs in Washington, D.C., they're part of the problem too. I mean, I've said to the president, you should really be suspect of people who want to stay in Washington, D.C. after you hire them, because that means that they're feeding in and they're looking for a future in the Washington, D.C. system. We got to have people that give up and go back home.
Well, talk about that a little bit further, because obviously, you see people say, well, why can't Trump get this done? But no one talks about how many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are part of big government. They may be further entrenched. There are former Obama appointees that you now can't get rid of. You saw the stuff with the VA where a guy can be grossly incompetent, grossly negligent, essentially be stealing from, taxpayers, but more importantly, stealing from our veterans that need it, doing a terrible job, and you can't even fire them. You can't get rid of them. So, these Obama appointees and people from prior administrations that also, again, are taking advantage of the swamp, milking it for all it's worth, hate the fact that Donald Trump is pushing back on that, are literally preventing the duly elected president of the United States from enacting the policies that he's wanted to, because, they don't agree with it. It's not good for them. So they'll take the order. They'll sit on their hands. They'll wait for time to pass. Hopefully someone forgets. Hopefully no one follows in. Hopefully they can get, crooked Joe Biden elected, because then it'll go back to business as usual. Because, he's the perfect example, right? 50 years in Washington, D.C. He's never hired anyone, never created anything. He's just the epitome of the swamp. So talk a little bit about that culture of that sort of entrenched resistance, who are, again, supposed to be working for the president or for the U.S. government, but are really pushing their own agendas or that of prior administrations that are no longer relevant or no longer should be a part of it.
Yeah, so such an interesting question and a really complicated question. What I would say is, first of all, there are many people, and I know this from the State Department and from the intelligence community, who are careerists, who really just are smart people who want to serve their government. There are a lot of those people, and the more that those people are celebrated and promoted, the better. However, we have a labor pool to fill the federal government that is strictly just the Washington, D.C. circle. Yeah. You can't get a job if you don't live in Washington, D.C. You have to know the right website. You have to know the right lingo. You have to know somebody that when that job opens. And then, by the way, an outsider who can try to somehow say, well, I've got this outside government experience in the private sector. They don't view that as positive. They say, oh, wait, you weren't the junior deputy assistant secretary at the Labor Department for 4 years. Well, you can't now get this job in Interior because you've never been in the federal government. It's a system that rewards only those that know it, that know the lingo, that live there. I think if we're going to have a conversation about DC statehood, which I'm totally against, but I think one way to kill it fast is to say, well, no state should have the entire federal government bureaucracy inside it. If we're going to have DC statehood, then we should dismantle the bureaucracies in Washington, D.C. and spread them around to the other states. Why should one state get everything? The idea that DC is not a state is because all of the federal government is there. If you want to implode that and you want to treat it like every other state, then you have to dismantle the bureaucracy in Washington, put it in Kansas, put it in Colorado, put it in Illinois and Indiana and Ohio.
I have a feeling they won't do that, Rick.
Yeah,
I have a feeling they won't do that. But that, and you're right. I think that's sort of the problem. I think it's why Trump was able to be so effective. Again, despite unprecedented resistance, right? There wasn't a single economic metric where we weren't better off. We got trade deals done that everyone said couldn't get done. We got NAFTA renegotiated with the USMCA. Everyone said they couldn't be done. And Donald Trump did it despite 3-year Russia hoax, unprecedented resistance, saying the president is an agent of Russia. They tried putting me in jail, and he still got it done, which shows and tells me, because common sense is the only thing not so common in D.C., that maybe if you have an outsider, maybe if you have someone that has real world experience, maybe if you have someone that's actually signed the front of a paycheck, actually had responsibility, created something in the real world outside of that D.C. bubble, maybe we can get these results more often, and Trump isn't just an anomaly, but they're doing whatever they can to protect themselves from that outsider coming in. Now, guys, we got to take a break. We'll be back in a few seconds with Richard Grenell.
Antifa is destroying our communities, rioting, looting. Yet Joe Biden kneels down and his staff sends money for bail. And Biden fails to stand up to the radical leftists fighting to defund and abolish the police. With Biden kneeling to the left, we'd have chaos in the streets. President Trump is standing up for us, keeping our communities safe, protecting minority-owned businesses, and always standing for our flag.
I'm Donald J. Trump, and I approve this message.
All right, guys, we are back. We're having an awesome conversation with Rick Grenell. Now, Rick, when you moved over to the DNI, I think actually probably the highest position for an openly gay person in DC history, which is pretty awesome and sort of contrary to the narrative. And it's amazing that the media, in all of their identity politics glory, never once mentioned that, because, maybe it would go towards Trump and maybe it would talk about a meritocracy rather than what we see in D.C. But you were one of the key figures in exposing what happened to General Flynn. I've said it numerous times now, but I'm pretty vocal. And the one thing that I wasn't all that vocal about was what happened to General Flynn, because I'm saying, well, if all of these people and the FBI and the CIA and all of these former maybe there must be something there. I, as an American, I couldn't imagine that these people and these institutions were so corrupted, and that these guys would violate every oath they ever took, every notion in the Constitution, to try to push their partisan agenda. So, I mean, I guess it's on me for still believing in these institutions, but it turns out these guys are just there to protect those institutions, not protect the Constitution, not protect our freedoms. And you took a lot of heat by exposing this, but all you did was put a little sunlight disinfectant on the problem. You just said, here's the information for the American people. I want you to see it. You took a lot of heat for that, and all you were showing was transparency, which is seemingly grossly lacking. Talk about your experience with it. Talk about why it's so important, and talk about why it's so important for something like this never to happen again to anyone, whether it's President Trump and the multiple-year nonsense, whether it's, you know, three-star General Flynn, or any American, frankly, from either party.
Yeah, look, you cannot talk about the Flynn case or investigations or political prosecutions like this without really understanding that this, again, goes to what we've been talking about, which is the D.C. way. They want in Washington, D.C. to keep as much information classified and in the back room so that a few people make the decision and that the rest of America just kind of gets spoon-fed little pieces of information. That is the DC way. But for me, transparency is neither political or nefarious. It's really a process to show the American people, hey, this is who your government is, and therefore you could have a lot more faith in your government if you had more transparency. So when I started reading some of the Flynn stuff, it really made me sad, I have to be honest with you, because first of all, we saw in the footnotes that I declassified, there were 32 footnotes. I had a couple of senators come to me and say, can you declassify these 6 footnotes? So because Congress asked me, I looked at the 6 footnotes and I thought, not only should I declassify the 6 footnotes, I'm going to look at all of them. And we ended up declassifying about 32 or 33. It surprised the senators. They said, oh, wow, I can't believe that you're being this transparent. But the fact of the matter is that all of the footnotes that were classified and pushed away concerning the Flynn Steele document, Steele dossier, and the Flynn process, all of that was not giving away sources or methods. It was covering up mistakes. It was trying to make sure that the early red flags, those people who said that the Steele dossier is not what people are saying, all of those comments, what I say, early red flags about how this collusion narrative was woven together, all of those early red flags were classified and pushed away. And when I started seeing all these people in the very beginning saying, this is not true, or we don't have very good tradecraft here, or look how the Russians are knowing exactly what's going on and are feeding the Steele dossier. All of this made me quite sad, actually, that this cover-up was happening. So once we declassified the footnotes, then I started reading the transcripts of all of the people, including you, who went under oath in the House Intel Committee. It was remarkable because under oath, when people are sitting inside a room with lawyers all around them, they say what they know to be true. And we have Samantha Power, we have Susan Rice, a plethora of people who would say under oath, I saw nothing, I have no evidence of collusion, nothing is there. They would say that in secret, and then in public, the narrative from Adam Schiff and Susan Rice and others was, oh my gosh, you can't believe the collusion we found. And so it made me sad again that we have a system in Washington that allowed someone in private to say, I see nothing, and in public say something completely different. And I know that's the ways of Washington, where you get to say one thing and only a few people know and it's quiet. But what's really sad about it is that we've got a whole bunch of journalists who are playing that game, who are advocates, who are trying to protect Washington, D.C. because they live there, their kids go to school there, they are going to be there long after President Trump is finished and the next president is finished. This is their life. They have mortgages there. Their kids are going to grow up. Their kids are going to come back.
I've seen that myself. As you said, you read, I did 30 hours of testimony. Now, I don't think I would have gotten the same benefit as those on the left and part of the deep state who literally have lied under oath to the House and to the Senate and to the American people.
Raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Please be seated.
If I'd have made a grammatical error, they'd have thrown me in jail. But they hold themselves to, if they lie, not only are they not penalized, they're given positions at CNN so they can talk about it. And again, you make a great point, because what they're saying on CNN, there was obviously collusion. I know it. I've seen evidence. But under testimony, how can they get away with that in those positions? Because the problem is they're on TV. They had these former positions in government. So there is a level of credibility, sort of like how I couldn't attack Flynn, the notion of the attack on Flynn. I couldn't go all in because I got, wow, there's 30 people from the intelligence community saying X, Y, Z, but then you read their actual testimony and it's all lies, but it doesn't stop them from going on TV, having credibility because of those positions and just lying. And the American people have seen that now for months and years.
That's where we have to have reporters who hold those people in power and the people who are testifying and trying to create narratives. You got to hold them to account. You have to be able to be a journalist that is unbiased and pushing for the truth. And I think what we see across the board in Washington is the swamp has taken over the newsrooms. Mm-hmm. And we have a whole bunch of reporters who are advocates and who are really putting their thumb on the scale and trying to elect certain people. And again, I go back because they live there. This is their life. If you work for the Los Angeles Times, you may not have a connection to Los Angeles at all.
Yeah. That's what it is. They're no longer journalists. They've just abdicated that position to become activists. I mean,
you to know that our hearts are out there marching with them. Please tweet us your comments. Poppy Harlow is up next.
I think you were a part of a great example of this. You were on let's talk a little bit about John Bolton sort of being one of those guys that can get away with it. He signs a $2 million book deal, supposedly, because he'll say bad stuff about Trump. The left, who 5 minutes before that hated John Bolton, welcomes him fully. Let's go to the clip of you on CNN with Erin Burnett, because I think it's a pretty epic smackdown. And it's also sort of ironic the way she's become, part of the resistance, given that I was there when she used to beg to come on The Apprentice and to get a shot in the boardroom to try to make a name for herself. So, sort of watching the turnaround is remarkably ironic given the history. But I thought you did a good job putting her in a place. Let's go to the clip and then let's let you talk about it.
So which is it, Ambassador? I mean, he's saying it's highly classified or it's fake. It can't be both.
Of course it can be both. What are you talking about? Life is not so simple.
Wait, so you're saying there's highly classified information that the president's aware of that's made up and sitting there that Bolton put in the book?
I'll answer the question if you let me. So here is the point. There can be a nugget of classified information. There can be something in there that shows sources and methods. It can be talking about things that are classified, but then completely gone in another direction, completely made up, completely misused. Life is not so simple that it's either or. You can tell a story that has a nugget of classified information that is a totally erroneous story that goes off on a tangent and gives a false impression. I mean, let me give you one example of a nugget of information that completely is made up and wrong that people believe. It's when CNN reported for a very long time that Kim Jong-un was brain dead. Now, I can't go into great details, but the fact of the matter is that was erroneous, but had a nugget of classified information in there, and we couldn't correct the record because of classified sources and methods. But that story ran for a very long time, and people believed it, and then it never really was corrected later on.
So, Rick, I mean, pretty amazing. Great job. Thank you for being one of the few that pushes back and doesn't just blindly follow where these activists, used to be called journalists, try to lead you. Why don't you talk a little bit about Bolton and that sort of showdown?
Well, look, I think the theme on both the Bolton book and the CNN clip is really media leaks, right? I mean, the John Bolton NSC leaked everything. They leaked transcripts about President Trump. They leaked details of who was in the Oval Office, who was having a Coke, who was having 2 scoops of ice cream. They leaked everything, and I was really troubled to see that there were these big, huge, dramatic stories that didn't leak but were packaged for a book, and that doesn't pass the smell test. I mean, this is one of those situations where clearly all of this was packaged. The book came out really fast. I mean, can't we agree that he was writing every single night in his office or at home and writing down dramatic stories and therefore making them this kind of book proposal, $2 million storytelling? I just don't think that anyone is going to believe that these stories didn't leak. And when it comes to intelligence, which clearly the NSC has told us that there are a lot of nuggets of intel in this Bolton book, I just find it really terrible that we have a system right now that's cherry picking intelligence and leaking out little pieces. Remember that intelligence is an estimate, right? We get thousands and thousands of little nuggets of things that we hear or people say. Not all of that is true. You got to weed through it. And you have to be able to know, one of the best things about the intelligence community is not just what they tell us is true, but what they tell us is false. That's one of the best parts of this. And so when you have an intelligence process of analysts looking at things, you don't want a political person digging down and saying, hey, put your thumb on this or leak it and pretend like it's bigger than what it is. And so you can't have it both ways. You can't demand that political people not get involved in intelligence, and then when there's a process where intelligence officers are looking to verify, then you got to say, well, why didn't you get in there and put your thumb on the scale? It's a double-edged sword.
Well, it really is. And again, it's sort of ironic watching the left try to make John Endless Wars Bolton one of these heroes. And the reality, it seems like he was bitter because Donald Trump, the duly elected president of the United States, did not want to take his advice and go in and continue these wars that have been so disastrous, have gotten us virtually nothing other than a few $1 trillion added to our deficits. It's pretty disgusting. But to watch him then be lionized, and again, to your point about cherry picking, we'll talk about this information because it hurts Trump. This stuff where Trump actually cracked down is forcing people to cooperate. That's totally neglected, and that's totally put aside. So, yeah, it's amazing to see, and I'd love to see those things be depoliticized. I'm just not sure that happens. I mean, the best way that I can see that happening is maybe through 4 more years of Trump, just because of attrition, right? The swamp doesn't get what they want. Eventually, people retire. You can replace them with people who are in it for the right reason.
One point is why not move some of these bureaucracies outside of Washington and put them in the rest of America? Right. Even COVID is demonstrating that it's a problem to have everybody in the same place. I mean, you want all of the intel agencies shut down because they're all giving each other COVID. I mean, that's the risk. Shouldn't we spread it around? Shouldn't we have bureaucracies outside? I do think that would be a solution, is to create a tension between those in Washington and those outside of Washington so that when they discuss issues, there's a different perspective.
Well, I think without question, and honestly, there's a lot of departments. I mean, obviously, one that's sort of near and dear to my heart is the Department of the Interior. But the fact that is based in Washington and not out west, and that so many of the people involved in prior administrations were there now, they're trying to actually do exactly what you're suggesting, which is branch it out and actually have people live with the stakeholders. Yeah. And the people who are on the ground and the people that understand the localized issues, not, again, an activist in D.C. who has no idea, has never been there, but can be sold an emotional argument that doesn't actually fit what's going on the ground. So I think it's a great idea. So I got one last question for you. we touched on it a little bit before because last month was Pride Month. You are the highest ranking ever openly gay American to be appointed into a cabinet position. And you've worked on an incredible campaign, which is something that the president has worked on pretty heavily. He's been pretty vocal about. He's, I think, the first person to run for the presidency who was, okay on the gay marriage issue and these sort of things. But the decriminalization of homosexuality across the globe, obviously, it's going to be something that's you understand. You've, I'm sure, been attacked for it. And again, going into some of these places and dealing with countries like Iran that you did as ambassador to Germany, talk a little bit about that, because again, I think it's such an important issue. I know I've been pretty vocal about it myself. You've been on the front lines of that one and the Trump administration's push to decriminalize those issues.
Yeah, the Trump administration is reportedly starting a global campaign to decriminalize homosexuality. The campaign is said to be heavily aimed at Iran. Officials tell Fox News the U.S. ambassador to Germany has been working on this issue for months.
Latest efforts led by Ambassador Grenell had a newer sense of urgency after reports surfaced in late January that Iran publicly hung a man accused of violating the country's anti-gay laws. Grenell, who is openly gay, called it outrageous and barbaric, and at the time told FoxNews.com, "I am committed to a more aggressive coordination with our European allies to make clear that criminalizing homosexuality is incompatible with the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights."
Talk about your experience doing that, the gains that we've made, the roadblocks that you've faced, both here and abroad.
Well, first of all, let me just say I want to thank you personally, because you have been a warrior on this issue. To just recognize that decriminalization of homosexuality, trying to make sure you don't put someone in jail just for being gay, or God forbid, punish them by pushing them off a building, that's pretty basic. And I grew up evangelical Christian. I have my nephews and nieces who are ministers who actually 100% agree with me, and they said it's a crazy idea that you would criminalize homosexuality. God doesn't want that. No matter what your religious belief, you should get behind this first step of decriminalizing homosexuality. I don't even think of it as an LGBT exclusive issue. I think of it as a basic human right.
Oh, 100%. I mean, if we want to talk about equality, I mean, it seems like a pretty logical place to start, that you don't throw someone off of a building or light them on fire because of their sexual preferences. Now, again, because Trump did it, though, something that to honestly anyone in the world that I've ever come into, it seems like a no-brainer. It's so obvious. And yet they either won't talk about it. They're sort of like, well, maybe it's okay because culturally that's what those cultures believe. I mean, it's nonsense. But because Trump was the guy that said, hey, we're going to be the first to actually do this. It's sort of amazing to me that I see it, from the LGBT community even, either pretending it didn't happen, continuing to attack the administration for other things, pushing sort of a false narrative.
Anti-Muslim. How about that? I mean, some people will say when you go after decriminalization that you're being, anti-Islam of some sort. But look, I wish that people could see President Trump's heart on this. And my conversations with him about, his friends in the 80s that were incredibly talented and wiped out through AIDS in New York City. He's got some amazing perspective about these issues, and I love it when he talks about it. And he's really annoyed that we have 69 countries that criminalize homosexuality. So what we've tried to do is launch this initiative to really take a stand and to empower American diplomats to say unequivocally, this is a strong U.S. priority. There is this debate, not to get too much into the details, but some people at the State Department think that Americans shouldn't talk about these issues because if you're in Africa or if you're in the Middle East, somehow it becomes, oh, the Americans are trying to export gay. And I just think it's crazy concept. We shouldn't play into it, and we should confront it directly and to say there are gay people everywhere. And the fact that you want to criminalize it is not going to make it go away. So we have made some good progress. I brought this up to heads of state, to diplomats, to Arab diplomats. I brought it up to a foreign minister of a Arab country. I have to say this. we get lots of private support from these individuals, surprisingly private support. What I'm trying to do is to move that private support to public pronouncements. And to be honest, it mirrors what I've seen. I've been to every convention, Republican convention, since 1992. And I can tell you that the arc of acceptance on gay conservatives mirrors what I see is beginning to happen on the decriminalization issue, where public support is lacking, but private support begins to increase.
Well, by the way, I even saw more of that, myself, because when Peter Thiel, the first openly gay guy to speak at the Republican National Convention that I'm aware of, in 2016, he said it. And he came out basically and said it. Now, I don't think anyone even really knew before the speech. And I promise you, he got an applause line from some pretty ardent conservatives that rivaled, the Supreme Court and the Second Amendment. I mean, for me, I'm sitting there being like, whoa, because even I sort of bought into the stereotypes that the media tried to create, about conservatives and their views on homosexuality. And honestly, you're there with probably some of the most conservative people in the country. And literally, he gets a standing ovation talking about coming out as being gay.
Also President Trump, and the president actually he brought this up to me recently, where he said, "Do you remember my speech at the convention when I came out very solidly for equality and LGBT rights and talked about Peter Thiel?" And he said it was one of the largest applause lines. And this is the president saying this. He goes, "I stopped and I went off script and I said, I'm so happy that you clapped and stood up for that point."
As your president, I will do everything in my power to protect our LGBTQ citizens from the violence and oppression of a hateful foreign ideology. Believe me. And I have to say, as a Republican, it is so nice to hear you cheering for what I just said. Thank you.
It was remarkable because he thought that he was being courageous in that room to take a firm stand for equality. And to the surprise of many, it was a great applause line, and that people actually in a Republican convention, activist Republicans, were very supportive. I will finish with this. I don't know of a single elected Republican that could get away with being anti-gay right now. I think they would be shouted down. I think they would be run out. And I just don't know a single one that would stand up and do that.
Well, that doesn't stop them from running with the narrative, but I think it's awesome, Rick, given, you being so, out and open about it. And honestly, doing the things that you've done as a conservative in this administration, that there's a gay Republican that's literally leading the charge against the nonsense is truly awesome to me. It's an honor to call you a friend. I look forward to seeing you in person soon. I look forward to, again, following your Twitter game as you're able to ramp up the heat a little bit now that you're outside of government and can speak your mind a little bit more freely. And I just want to thank you for being on the show. Awesome as always, man. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for doing these podcasts. Awesome.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
We will make America great again.